Are American efforts to end the war in Gaza doing more harm than good? While everyone wants the remaining hostages held by Hamas returned home and the fighting to stop, is President Donald Trump's peace proposal realistic? And even if it could be implemented, is there any reason to think that Hamas is simply going to hand over Gaza to former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, Qatar, and the Palestinian Authority? And even if they did, wouldn't that merely be a repetition of past experiments in peacemaking that always fail because the Palestinians actually support the Islamist goal of destroying Israel and the genocide of the Jewish people? Next, on Think Twice, we take a deep dive into the Trump plan and whether it is a path to a Nobel Peace Prize or to disaster and more bloodshed. Hello, and welcome to Think Twice. Today we have a fascinating conversation for you about the ongoing war on Hamas in Gaza and the U.S. efforts to end it, as well as a general assessment about the state of U.S.-Israel relations and the surge of anti-Semitism around the globe with my JNS colleague, Ruthie Blum. But before we start today's program, I want to remind you, as always, that in addition to Think Twice, there is a Jonathan Tobin daily podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Jonathan Tobin Daily on the JNS channel wherever you get your podcasts. One programming note, we'll be off the next 2 weeks for Sukkot, but we'll return on October 23rd with a new episode. And now to today's program. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu came to the United States for more than just the privilege of allowing the anti-Semites at the UN the opportunity to stage a walkout when he addressed the UN General Assembly. The main agenda on his itinerary was a visit to the White House to talk over a new American peace plan from the Trump administration, whose goal is an end to the war in Gaza, the return of the Israelis being held hostage by Hamas, as well as a blueprint for a post-war administration of Gaza. The plan was cooked up by Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, with a lot of input from the funders of Islamist extremism in Qatar. Ostensibly, it charts a path for a Gaza that wouldn't be ruled by Hamas. But is it remotely realistic to imagine that Hamas will simply surrender Gaza to anyone, let alone Tony Blair and an American plan? And would the proposed security force there have a ghost of a chance to stop Hamas terrorists from operating or ensure Israeli security if the IDF is forced to withdraw completely from the Strip? And can any good come from anything that involves Qatar and its little friend in the Trump administration, Steve Witkoff, as well as the Palestinian Authority? To break this all down, I'm very happy to have my dear friend and JNS colleague Ruthie Blum with us today to discuss it. Ruthie Blum is a former advisor at the Office of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and an award-winning columnist and a senior contributor and editor at JNS. She is the co-host with Mark Regev of the JNS TV podcast Israel Undiplomatic. In her column, she writes about Israeli politics and U.S.-Israel relations, and she's also the author of To Hell in a Handbasket, Carter, Obama, and the Arab Spring. Ruthie, welcome back to Think Twice.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan. It's always great to be with you in person and also remotely with you in the United States and me in Israel. I hope that I will be able to articulate my positions today because I'm in quite a panic about what's going on.
Okay, well, Ruthie, thanks for taking the time to join us today. I want to start by asking you to set the scene for us in the White House with the talks between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump and his team. Is Netanyahu walking into a trap this week?
Well, I don't think he's walking into a trap this week. This has been ongoing. He's been kept in the loop all along the last days and weeks. So it's not a trap. He's not surprised by anything that's going on.
Right.
And we keep hearing about a 21-point plan. I have no doubt that Netanyahu and Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer have been perusing the plan and perhaps even wrote some of the points of it. That I don't know, but it seems that that's the case. So he's not surprised. And he was greeted very warmly, as usual, by President Trump at the entrance to the White House. We saw that. As he approached, they shook hands warmly, as usual, and they went in. And I'm not sure if I'm reading this into it, but Netanyahu turned around also to wave to reporters, as did President Trump. Netanyahu looked a little bit worried. It's possible that, as I said, I was projecting my own panic onto him. He's also exhausted. I'm sure he hasn't slept in days. This is a very crucial moment right now in the war. And one thing I will say that so the stages, they went in, they were having meetings, and then they're going to have lunch and then make a joint statement, which was supposed to take place at a certain hour, and it's been postponed. It'll take place later, and that usually happens as well. So this is not a trap. The question, though, is anything really going to come of it? That's the ultimate question. We've been talking about it, but there are certain elements of this plan, which I wouldn't call a peace plan. I know that Trump likes to call it that, but you know, this isn't exactly peace. An end to a war with those barbarians is not peace. It's maybe the best we can hope for. I'm not sure about that. It's possible, but I wouldn't call it peace.
Yeah, well, let's talk a little bit about the authors of the Trump plan. You seem to be intimating that the Israelis, you know, they knew about it. Everybody, you know, it's kind of been an open process. But the main people driving this seems to be Jared Kushner, who is Trump's former advisor in his first term and son-in-law, and former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. So the question is, what the heck is Tony Blair doing there? And just how much should Friends of Israel trust him or Jared Kushner to do the right thing here?
Well, here's the thing. It's not a question of trusting them to do the right thing. The first question is, if it is true that this plan, before any of it takes place, the very first thing that has to happen is that Hamas, in the first 48 hours of reaching this agreement, so-called agreement, has to return every single hostage, 20 live hostages and 28 dead ones. Now, right there, that's upfront. Now, I'm very skeptical that Hamas is going to do that. And if Hamas does not do that, then there is no plan.
Right.
According even to President Trump, I'm not saying only according to Netanyahu. So if that is the condition, now, here's the tricky part. All Israelis, all Jews, I think all people want those hostages home. Not all people. Hamas doesn't.
Decent people, shall we say.
Decent people want the hostages home, and certainly all Israelis, and we are praying for them. The 20 live ones are being tortured and starved, and it is just outrageous. So we all want to see them home. And if they actually do come home, that will be a huge relief to the entire public. Having said that, if what comes after that is that Israel has to withdraw from Gaza, not have military control, set a path for a Palestinian state, and all of that, you know, Tony Blair doesn't bother me so much. I mean, you know what's ironic, by the way, about former British Prime Minister Tony Blair is that, you know, I always thought of him as very, you know, squishy liberal. I wasn't a fan. However, compared to Keir Starmer, Tony Blair is like
a pillar of strength.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
so
although he is deeply, deeply unpopular in Britain. I mean, he can't get arrested in Britain anymore. You know, where people blame him for the Iraq War. I mean, it's like, I think Americans have kind of, you know, have forgiven George W. Bush, but the Brits have not forgiven Tony Blair.
Right.
He's from an earlier era of labor. You know, the new labor of the 1990s is, you know, something on the dustbin of history as the left in Britain has sort of taken over. Keir Starmer is a sort of watered down version of that as opposed to Jeremy Corbyn. But yeah, I mean, for sure, he's tougher than Keir Starmer, but that doesn't say much.
Right. So, in some ways it seems like a joke because it's not a question of whether we trust Jared Kushner. And I mean, Jared Kushner did some very good things in President Trump's first term. It's not the issue of not trusting them, okay? Because first of all, President Trump, I've got to say a good word for Trump. There has been no better friend to Israel in the White House than Trump. And it has to be stated because whatever happens here, this also creates a problem for Netanyahu, because the last thing in the world that Netanyahu would want to do is antagonize the best friend Israel's ever had in the White House and not get on his bad side. And also, he may have no reason to do that. So I guess my hope here is, first of all, if the hostages come home, and that's a big if, because Hamas is already saying, well, we might not be able to
lost track of some of them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Also, Hamas, what I'm failing to understand in all of this plan is what's in it for Hamas. We know that it is, okay, Israel will agree if they, lay down their weapons, that some of the leaders who aren't dead yet will be allowed to stay, will be allowed to leave Gaza and go live somewhere else. We know that. And that's a price we can pay. I mean, Netanyahu said that all along, that he'd be willing. That's one of the things he'd be willing to negotiate. But what is in it for them to release all the hostages right at the start? Because had it done so all along, I mean, what Hamas fears, rightly, is that if it releases all the hostages, it has no more leverage whatsoever, and it's not protected anymore. And therefore, Israel, even if it does withdraw, at the first rocket, at the first RPG, at the first whatever drone that comes from Gaza, then Israel has to reserve the right to do what it's doing in Lebanon with Hezbollah. We signed a ceasefire there too. But we have not stopped fighting Hezbollah. We reserved the right to protect ourselves. And I believe that President Trump agrees with that. All right. Mm-hmm. And again, but all of this is up in the air. What's ridiculous in this plan is that it's paving some kind of path to a Palestinian state, which is nonsense. There can be no Palestinian state. There will be no Palestinian state. First of all, no Palestinian wanted a state. They've never worked towards statehood. They have worked towards eliminating the Jewish state. And and also keep in mind that Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, the only thing that's kept him relevant on the international stage is pretending to strive for a state. That has kept him in clover, literally billions of dollars, euros, shekels over the years. And it keeps him, it gets him standing ovations at the UN. He is loathed at home. The Palestinians, I don't even like to call them Palestinians, but okay, the Arabs in Ramallah and the Arabs in Gaza, they all hate him. He's not just because he's corrupt, but because he's weak and he's not one of them. They hate him. He's only relevant because he supposedly strives for statehood. It's not that he wants it. The minute he's turned it down so many times, and if he did achieve it, he would immediately lose all relevance and he'd probably be assassinated. But even if he stayed alive.
We know that such a state would be quickly taken over by Hamas unless Israel intervened.
Well, exactly. And it wouldn't be a state. It would be a terror enclave like the way Gaza is.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. If we look back to the day that Gilad Shalit was released from Gaza, from Hamas's clutches after 5 years in captivity.
In 2011, yeah.
In 2011. He had been in there for 5 years, and the country was going crazy over this one young soldier. There were fights over whether we ransom him or whether we don't. And, and there was a lot of pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. In the end, it was Netanyahu who made the deal to release him. The deal,
which was very popular in Israel.
Yeah. And unfortunately, as part of that deal, Yahya Sinwar was released, and he's the orchestrator of the October 7th massacre, but he's not the only bloodthirsty terrorist who was released. So, but nevertheless, on that day that Gilad Shalit was released, we all wept. Even those of us who were totally against the deal and knew that it would result in horrible terrorism and future kidnappings. We knew it, and yet seeing him come home was a moment we all wept for. And if these 48 hostages come home this week, that's what Israelis will feel, probably Jews around the world as well. Maybe not J Street, I don't know. I don't know. There are Jews I can't fathom, the ones who support Hamas. But as a general rule, we will all be weeping for joy. And then we'll have to confront the reality of the cost to us of that move.
Right. As happened after the Shalit deal as well. And we won't know that cost even for years. I mean, because it will be long term. Let's talk about another element of this proposal, which is, what is Qatar's role in all of this? Why does the Trump, plan grant them an exemption from Israeli attacks, as well as a testimonial to their good behavior? And how crazy is that?
It's totally insane. Qatar is, along with Iran, the greatest sponsor of terrorism, but not just terrorism. I mean, in some ways, Qatar is worse than Iran, because what it has done has funded all these NGOs, universities, and it has entered Europe, the United States, and of course, the Al Jazeera TV station. It has infiltrated the hearts and minds of young people in the West. It has taken over. It has done something very, very pernicious and clever by seeping into these societies and undermining them from within, so that you didn't even need for that to fire rockets. It actually has been brilliant. And also, Qatar has been bribing all kinds of figures around the world, and it's very tempting. And they also bribed President Trump with an airplane and all that. I mean, they're very rich. They're a terrorist entity that's acting like the world's ATM. And it's been appalling all along that we've been treating them, we, Israel as well, as mediators to return hostages when they are Hamas, funding Hamas, housing Hamas, the leaders of Hamas in Qatar. But I'll tell you something. You mentioned that there's a promise not to attack, that Israel won't repeat what it did a couple of weeks ago by trying to assassinate the leaders in Doha, the Hamas leaders in Doha. But ironically, it's clear that attempt pushed Qatar to start pressuring Hamas and say, you guys, you better do this or we're kicking you out. And the reason we know that is clearly Qatar said, uh-oh, now they're going to start bombing our buildings. Forget about it. Like Hamas, it's not worth it to us to put up Hamas in these, fancy digs, right? Living lives of luxury. And they're endangering us, because as long as they sit here, and Israel vowed to get them wherever they are. So we need to get them out of here. And we need to tell them right now, get those hostages out. All right? Now, Qatar could have done that 2 years ago, right?
Yeah, but they didn't. But let's drill down to another element of this, which is, why does the most pro-Israel U.S. administration ever think so well of Qatar? What is the connection here? We've spoken before on this podcast about Steve Witkoff being bailed out by them. But I think the Kushner part of this is also because, Kushner is very pro, obviously he's a friend of Israel. He's Jewish. He's married to the president's daughter, but he's his main business these days is doing business in the Middle East, investing in the Gulf. He's in bed with all of these Arab leaders. If you read his memoir, which I reviewed when it came out a couple of years ago, it's all about how he's been wined and dined and honored in all of these petty little monarchies, and he's very much in bed with these people. and sort of believes in them and thinks that they're sort of, good players. And there's an element, of that makes sense there, because I think, these countries want to make peace. They don't necessarily want to make peace with Israel, but they want to do business with America, and they want to do, they want normal relations. They want to be protected from Iran, or at least some of them other than Qatar. What's going on there with this?
Look, you're right. We talked a lot about that, about members of the administration. We said in the very beginning, Steve Witkoff is in bed with Qatar and his son, and I don't know, and Jared Kushner and everything. But I say, even if we leave off the part that sounds like corruption or bribery or whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, it kind of does sound like corruption and bribery. Yes,
it does.
Leave that aside for a moment.
Let's say it's not. Okay, there are other psychological explanations too. Okay, it's not just corruption. First of all, these guys who are businessmen, they are not, I think they're less focused on the understanding about political religious ideology and the power that it has. And they are more used to making deals that have to do with business interest. We both have interests and we try to align those interests. And I mean, that's true in international diplomacy, but only to an extent, because radical Islam is not something you can negotiate away.
Right. It's not a transaction, for them.
It's not. And it's the way we've always said that in Israel, the, Palestinian issue, it's not a real estate deal. And a lot of people don't get that. And by the way, I just would like to mention, you mentioned that Jared Kushner is Jewish. And so what? Chuck Schumer is Jewish. You want me to name you a bunch of Jews? And often in Israel, they'll say, no, Trump he has Jewish grandchildren. And I say, oh yeah, you wanted me to name you a bunch of Jews we know who are totally anti-Israel, who have Jewish grandchildren? That's not an argument. In fact, the fact that he's Jewish actually is surprising that he's so pro-Israel these days. That's my feeling on the matter. So let's say it's not corruption. Let's say they are lulled into, there is something very, very seductive about Arab culture. I can tell you that also because living in Israel for decades, there's nothing like Arab hospitality. Seriously. It's warm, it feeds you, and there's a lot of, alongside honor killing of their daughters and wives, there is honoring guests. They're great hosts. They're very
that's really
warm.
all in Kushner's memoir. It's like it's account after account of being wined and dined and honored in this fashion. You're absolutely right.
And by the way, he was being wined and dined and all that by rich people. But even poor Arabs are like that. I'm saying there is something very seductive, especially when you come from a Western country or, where really, even to get good food, you need to go to a fancy restaurant. But you're eating fast food. There isn't a whole culture of taking hours to eat a meal, surrounded by loving, people, family and guests. It is very seductive, and especially if it's in a palace, of course. But it doesn't even have to be in a palace. It can be in a Bedouin tent. I'm telling you, it is you're enveloped with warmth. And there are Israelis in the past who used to joke about that. They'd say, they will feed you and they will hug you and then they'll stab you in the back, right? I mean, so that's the truth of the matter. I know it sounds like a broad generalization, but if you cannot understand the Middle East unless you actually understand the culture and the language. And there are not enough people who know the language. And even those who know the language don't know the greater language, the whole culture that comes along with it.
The subtleties of what go behind it, yeah.
Exactly. So I would say, even if I'd like to give Jared Kushner the benefit of the doubt and Trump and even Witkoff, because I have to say, everyone who's met him, I haven't met him, but in the hostage families, they really say he's been so kind and I have no reason to doubt that. I don't know. He may be a really good guy. I don't know. But I will say,
as I always like to say, sincerity is a very overrated virtue.
Yeah, it can be, especially if it, but as I say, I think the real trouble here, alongside with what might be corruption, is also having the wool pulled over their eyes. But look, I have to say that Netanyahu, you know, 2 weeks before the October 7th massacre, I was working then at the Prime Minister's office, and he went to America. He traveled to America, where he met with Elon Musk in California, and then he went to address the United Nations. I was in the office in Israel. I didn't go with them, but I was following it, you know. So he met with Elon Musk because they were talking about AI, you know, and Israel's going to be in the forefront of, you know, artificial intelligence. It's the new wave, right? Mm-hmm. And then he went to the UN and he delivered a speech showing how the Abraham Accords will be expanded and Saudi Arabia. I don't remember, you know, the details, and he showed a map and this, you know, pieces busting out all over. And then he came back, and a few days later, whatever, I don't know, I can't give you the exact days, but a week later, it was all during the Jewish holidays that we're in right now, on Simchat Torah, and it was a Shabbat, and then the massacre happened. This was after saying pieces busting out all over and AI. Now, I'm not saying this in order to say that Netanyahu was, you know, at fault for the October 7th massacre. Everybody here was. This was going on for years, the build up to it, the ignoring the signs. But I will say that my initial instinct was, while your head is, this is how I felt. That first, you know, the first day was, while your head is in the clouds about AI and peace with Saudi Arabia, these jihadists are slaughtering and raping and beheading right under our noses. And the people you're making these deals with are also, though, you know, you call them moderates, and yes, they want the benefits of deals with Israel. And I have to say, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and everything, they really right away jumped in to embrace the Abraham Accords. However, as always has happened with Israel when it makes a treaty with somebody, Israelis went flooding the UAE. They went to Bahrain. They flew. They went. They ate. They did. They danced. In Egypt, when we had a peace treaty with Egypt, Israelis flooded Cairo. Let's go see belly dancers. And the pyramids. Did the Egyptians come as tourists to Israel? Did the Emiratis come flooding Israel? No. The point being that we have to stop being in, you know, it's important maybe to make those deals because we really do need to have peace with the Arabs that doesn't include, you know, being slaughtered.
Yeah, but Israelis are desperate to be loved.
Yeah, what is this fuzzy-wuzzy business, okay? We have to remember that it's not that they need us just as much, or if not more, than we need them. We need them to stop killing us. Yeah, but they need us for agriculture and technology and brain power and name it, okay? And what we need is for them to stop killing us or encouraging it or supporting it, all right? And that, the imbalance there has always driven me crazy. And again here, that's why I say whatever deal is going on with Gaza, calling it peace is a little bit, I mean, it's kind of outrageous at the moment, okay? Also, if the Emiratis are now threatening, as they have recently, Emiratis, our Abraham Accords partners, said, if you guys don't establish a Palestinian state, then the Abraham Accords are in danger of falling apart. Really? Excuse me, when did you ever care about those Palestinians? When did you ever help them? When during this war? 2 years, you're saying that they're being killed and innocent women and children. Who took them in? Who tried to help them?
Yeah.
I mean,
not them.
So, yeah, that's a lie. And not one of them wants them in there. Egypt wouldn't even let them go to the Sinai. So, you know, we have to keep our powder dry no matter what is the point.
Yeah. Now, I think at the heart of the Trump plan is a basic contradiction. On the one hand, Trump endorses the end of Hamas, the immediate release of the hostages, and he's for Israeli security. But the plan seems to presuppose that Israel's goal of eliminating Hamas by military force is basically impossible. That's what a lot of people in the American foreign policy establishment have been saying for the last 2 years. And it's also what many in the Israeli defense and intelligence establishments have also been saying. Are they right? Or is Netanyahu right to want to pursue military victory?
Netanyahu is right. And what we've seen is that military pressure is the only thing that has gotten us any hostages back, has eliminated serious terrorists, okay, not only in Gaza. I mean, we eliminated the head of Hezbollah. We performed that amazing beeper operation. We totally decimated Hezbollah. We attacked the Iranian nuclear sites, also with the help of President Trump, of course. We went around all of these fronts. We've also been fighting the Houthis in Yemen. We've been bombing them. Of course, we haven't finished the job because they keep firing drones and missiles at us. But the point is, of course, the military is the only way to go. And it's also not only is our this second chariot, what do you call it again? The operation in Gaza, Gideon's Chariot Part 2, together with our attempt to assassinate the Hamas leaders in Qatar. Those two things together are responsible for what's going on right now. I have to say, these protest movement people in Israel and the ridiculous liberals in America, they don't realize that that's what caused Hamas to say, okay, we'll deal in some fashion.
Yeah, well, that's very true. Now, the Trump plan, as well as the ones from the Europeans and the Arab states, also seem to hinge on massive investment in Gaza to rebuild it, and that this will somehow lead to a better future. But isn't this the same as every other peace plan and scheme for Gaza we've heard in the last 30 years? That always fails because the Palestinians share Hamas's goals, don't want peace, and won't, at best, this merely lead us back to where we were on October 6th, rather than to some new fantastic reality where peace becomes possible.
Absolutely. And, Netanyahu said all along, one of the war goals was that Gaza has to be de-radicalized. It's not just that Hamas has to lay down its weapons, all right? Because, Hamas goes and there's Islamic Jihad, you can name it what you name it. And what does he mean by de-radicalized? You realize that the children there, they are raised on textbooks that teach them to kill Jews, the sermons in the mosques, everything. They are raised, and by the way, in the Palestinian Authority as well. There's no way that rehabilitating buildings in an area will do anything if the people are still educated to aim to kill Jews, Christians, and Muslim infidels. And that has not changed one iota. So what he did understand, what we all understand, is that doesn't happen overnight. That takes 2 generations maybe, but certainly one. Okay, certainly one generation. And we don't see that happening. So, you're right. Rebuilding it. Do you know how many times Gaza has been rehabilitated, quote unquote, with billions of dollars going in there to after Hamas attacks Israel, we go in, we do something, then we have a ceasefire after 3 weeks or whatever, right? Not like these 2 years. We don't finish the job. They build more tunnels. They get tons of money. Every Gazan could have a tennis court and a swimming pool outside of his villa with the amount of money that has been poured into that place. And doing that again, for what? So they can build more tunnels? So now, the other thing is, okay, let's suppose, yes, they say, okay, we'll lay down our arms. Let's suppose all of that, there are unicorns flying over Gaza City. What is going to guarantee that one false move and we're back in there?
Who's going to stop them from building more tunnels and preparing,
the Israeli
rockets?
military is going to go. Right. The Israeli military is going to go out and what? They'll say, oh, listen, it was only one stray rocket and it really didn't come from the leaders there. You know, this is an ongoing thing that Israelis have done over the years repeatedly. No, it wasn't us. It was some minor group and they had a makeshift rocket. No, we've been there 100 times already. So, and we were there the minute that Ariel Sharon, the prime minister, who broke away from Likud and formed a party, Kadima, so that he could evacuate, pull out every last Jew from Gaza to do this thing called disengagement. And he said, yeah, but don't worry. One pebble comes over that wall, let alone a rocket. One pebble, and we're going to blast them. Did we? Nope. Nope. You know why? Because CNN might film it. You know,
yeah, the obstacles to Israeli Israeli efforts to stop more terrorism will be much greater now if there's some Tony Blair administration funded by the Emirates and Qatar and the U.S.
Well, unless President Trump has given Netanyahu absolute guarantees that in the event that one false move happens in that direction, that Israel is at liberty to do what it needs to do. Don't forget, he has said along, Israel has to do what it needs to do. He also says, finish the war, finish it already. But what he meant really was win it, you know? I mean, the truth is, there was a moment there when Trump actually hinted that we should just carpet bomb the whole place and forget about the hostages. He never said that. But what he said is, I know what I would do. I mean, he hinted, let's get this over with already. And that's what he meant. He didn't mean withdraw and leave Hamas there. No. He meant blitz the crap out of them. And we don't do that because we don't carpet bomb. And we didn't want to harm the hostages and we didn't want to harm Palestinian civilians. And,
it ignores something that I think you and I both understand, but which is denied by a lot of people in power, that this is not a war between Israel and Hamas, as much as, that's the shorthand way of referring to it. It's a war between Israel and the Palestinians. And I think this brings us back to, let's circle back to where we started a few minutes ago with this very difficult question from Netanyahu. Can he say no to Trump if, as is likely, he knows this plan is a catalog of awful, failed, recycled ideas? Or must he somehow finesse it and hope that Hamas does what it always does and says no and sabotages any hope for peace?
Well, it's a good question because here's what we call the downside to having such a good friend in the White House.
Right.
Because if it were President Biden or, heaven forbid, Kamala Harris, Netanyahu would say no. I mean, we saw him, he was being very careful with the Biden administration, but at some point he said, sorry, if you withhold weapons, we're going to fight with our fingernails. I mean, he put his foot down. With Trump, he's not going to do that. And by the way, I wouldn't advise him to either. That's not the tone he has to take with the Trump administration. And it wouldn't be wise for him to do it, and he won't do it. I mean, he's not stupid. He wouldn't do it, and he doesn't want to do it. So how will he finesse it? One thing is maybe he has inside information as well about the likelihood of Hamas returning all the hostages, or the likelihood, like what he knows is, I'm sure what he realizes is this business of some vague path to a Palestinian state. I figure he's saying to himself, well, we can live with that because they're not going to have one and they're not going to do it. And it's just words, empty words. The question is, what are the other things? And the other things are more dangerous, like, what about the Philadelphia corridor? What about Rafah? What about the Morag corridor? These are these things that lead between Egypt, corridors between Egypt and Gaza and all of this. And what perimeter, a safety perimeter do we have? There, it's trickier. And, I'm hoping that he was able or is able to persuade Trump and Kushner and everything that this is suicidal if we, and it also will mean all the soldiers were killed for nothing. Because, if we were gonna capitulate, we could have done that 2 years ago or something.
Exactly.
So
Which
I
is
think
what a lot of Netanyahu's critics are saying. That they want it both ways. That they're for capitulation, but then they're bashing Netanyahu at the prospect that he might have to capitulate.
right. Look, I don't know. As I said, we don't know yet what's happening. And it's true, we can't always rely on our enemies to reject everything and then say,
God hardens
so
Pharaoh's heart at a crucial moment in in the story of the Exodus. But
yes.
sometimes he does, and sometimes he doesn't. Now, we know the idea that Western nations recognizing Palestinian statehood at the UN General Assembly is a ridiculous exercise disconnected from reality. But is it possible, regardless of the fact that European attempts to intervene in the peace process is a joke, is Israel heading towards a situation where much of Europe will soon be boycotting it, crippling trade, which is very important to Israel, trade with the European Union, and creating a new reality in which it really is largely isolated outside of its ally, the United States?
Well, here, first of all, I think part of the reason that the European countries all jumped on, to recognize that was their way of clouding, like telling all their jihadist and progressive constituents, I'm on your side, right?
Yes.
Without having to boycott. Because here's the thing, you and I both know that in order to boycott Israeli goods, I mean, we've all made jokes about this, everybody would have to live in a cave. What are they going to do? Get rid of their cell phones and their computers and their everything and their chips and their medical devices and oh, really? Oh, you're a diabetic? Sorry. This part of that was invented in Israel. So is the likelihood that they're going to risk, because they have their own interests? I don't know. But I can tell you one thing. We do see that Europe is on such a steep decline, and anti-Semitism is both a result and a reflection. It's the canary in the coal mine. And that's no joke. What's happening in Europe, Europe has no birth rate, think of all the things that are wrong with Europe right now. Anti-Semitism, again, is a symptom of it, and it's also a result of that. But that's not the only thing going on there. Also, all the immigration, all the immigrants who say we have come here to cancel out British culture and French culture and
promote anti-Semitism and create conquer the West in a way that they couldn't militarily.
They are having children. They are having children. Europeans are not.
Yes.
So whatever is happening with them, for them to boycott Israel, that's a question. Who's going to be punished by that more?
Yes. Well, that's a lot of very short-sighted European leaders. Let's talk now about the Israeli political situation. We hear a lot about how exhausted Israelis are and keep seeing polls that say Israelis want the war against Hamas to end and that freeing the hostages is more important than defeating Hamas. But do you think the Israeli public is really willing to accept an end to the conflict that will let Hamas survive in one way or another?
The Israeli public is no longer, despite what the protest movement tells you, the Israeli public is so against Palestinian statehood and all the old adages. It's no accident that Israel has the most right-wing government in its history. That didn't happen by accident, and it didn't happen after the October 7th massacre. That happened months before. Right? And that was listen, you realize that even the left-wing parties couldn't have Palestinian statehood in their platforms if they wanted to get votes. So Israelis are, yes, weary of war, weary of that. Some of them don't like Netanyahu from the right, some don't like him from the left, etc. Like in any democracy, right?
Right, yeah.
But let me tell you something. The left, whatever the left has nothing to offer. And most Israelis know that. Now, you'll hear leftists telling you, what are you talking about? Look at the polls. 80% of Israelis want the war to end and the hostages home. And I say, no, 100% of Israelis want that. What does that mean? No, what they mean is, and they don't care about victory, and they don't care about this, and they don't care about, and the soldiers are weary, and the Haredim are not serving in the army and everything. Of course the reservists are weary. They've been fighting and going back in and out, and they're losing their jobs and their marriages. Of course they're weary. Does that mean that they think there's nothing worth fighting for, like Europeans? Not on your life. Nope. So, and it's true. I hear all these polls. I say, who cares about these election polls? We're not in elections right now.
Yeah.
This poll and that poll, and it depends what TV channel you're watching.
And how the polls are being, how the questions are
Exactly.
posed. Always.
Exactly.
Right. So I think you're right. The assumption that Israel's public is turning left or turning against Netanyahu. That's, we've been seeing these predictions for many years, and they usually turn out, almost always turn out to be wrong. Now, lastly, Trump seems to have promised that the Arabs that he won't let Israel annex Judea and Samaria, or even the so-called Area C, where the communities there where more than 500,000 Jews live. That reflects a longstanding belief among the Americans, the Europeans, and the Arabs that this land will someday be part of a Palestinian state. How important is it for Israel to assert its claim to even part of this land, and how much support for annexation is there among the Israeli public?
Okay, so first of all, it's sad to call it annexation because annexation implies that it's not yours. Extending sovereignty is a better word because it is our ancient land, et cetera. You might be surprised to hear that even I think that this isn't great timing. Right now, we're in the midst of all of this. And I would, I have right-wing friends who are on my side. We're on the same side, but, they think, no, you gotta pressure now because Trump won't be in the White House that long, and at least we have the evangelicals on our side, all that reasoning, which may be true. But I always say, you gotta pick your battles, guys, okay? And right now, when Netanyahu says, do me a favor, people, could you put a lid on it for a while? I mean, he even said that yesterday about a Knesset committee that voted for the death penalty for terrorists. Mm-hmm. Now, nobody in Israel minds about having death penalty for terrorists, right? But what Netanyahu was saying
would the Supreme Court ever let anyone actually be executed?
No, and we've had only one person in Israeli history who ever was put to death, and that was Adolf Eichmann. No, the point, though, is when Bibi says to them, will you guys do me a favor? I'm in the middle of something very crucial here. Don't make life more difficult for me.
Right.
And in that sense, I totally sympathize with him, including about sovereignty. We will extend sovereignty. Look how long it took to do it over the Golan Heights and declare Jerusalem the capital of Israel. It'll happen. Does it have to happen right now? Come on, people. Just wait 5 minutes. Except, of course, those politicians also have their constituents and,
Yeah. Israel isn't being shifted out of any part of Judea and Samaria, in reality. So the talk about, extend sovereignty, annexation, whatever you're calling it, it's not as crucial an issue as much as obviously there would be benefits to Israel to this in terms of preserving its hold on the land, which, is a separate issue. But I think you're right. This is a battle that Netanyahu doesn't need to fight now because he's fighting for much bigger stakes in terms of the war against Hamas and making sure that Gaza isn't turned back into a terror state. Ruthie, thanks so much for joining us today. Please read jns.org to read Ruthie's great columns and go to the JNS YouTube page to watch her weekly podcast, Israel Undiplomatic with Mark Regev, which is a smash every week. We also want to thank our audience. Please remember to read JNS at jns.org, subscribe to our newsletters, and also tune in every day for Jonathan Tobin Daily Edition, which is available on all the audio podcast platforms. And whether you're listening to us on any one of those various podcast platforms, watching us live on Facebook or X, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to JNS. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at thinktwice@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And one further programming note, we'll be off the next 2 weeks during Sukkot, but we'll be back with a new episode on October 23rd. Until then, Shana Tova, Gemar Chatima Tova, and remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again soon.